On October 11th, 1899, President Paul Kruger of the South Africa Republic, in alliance with the Orange Free State, declared war on the British in what would be called the Second Boer War. In the initial stages of the war, the Boer armies quickly overran large parts of the British colonies of Natal and Cape Colony and besieged several important cities. One of those sieges, the siege of the Cape Colony city of Kimberley, resulted in a surprising arms race, where unique and startlingly large for the era artillery pieces were employed. The strange story of the great guns of the siege of Kimberley is history that deserves to be remembered. The causes of the 1899 to 1902 Second Anglo-Boer War stem from more than a century of various disputes between Britain and Boers, a Dutch word meaning farmer and generally referring to those South African settlers who had immigrated from Cape Colony to live beyond the reach of the British colonial administration and formed the Boer republics of the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. In a narrower sense, the war was precipitated over conflict of who would control gold mines in the Transvaal. In the initial phase of the war, the Boer armies had a significant numerical advantage, owing to a process of mobilizing an energetic militia. While the Boer armies, broken up into groups called commandos, were not generally regular soldiers, the Boers were a generally independent people who were accustomed to life on the frontier, and the commandos were constituted from men who were both excellent horsemen and excellent rifle shots. The Boers were also equipped with some of the most modern weapons of the era, Paul Kruger's government having purchased large numbers of modern magazine-fed rifles and European artillery. Because of their ability to quickly mobilize the commandos at the outset of the war, frontline Boer troops outnumbered British troops in South Africa, nearly 3-1. In an offensive beginning in October, the Boer armies moved quickly into Cape Colony and Natal and besieged several towns with British garrisons. One of those was the northern Cape town of Kimberley. Kimberley was a town built on diamond mining, with an initial discovery in 1866. In 1873, the town was named Kimberley after the British Secretary of State for the Colonies, John Wodehouse, the Earl of Kimberley. The Secretary had demanded that before the territory could be given political boundaries, the settlements had to be given decent and intelligible names. Colonial Secretary J.B. Curry then decided to name the town Kimberley, assuming that if he named the town after his lordship, then he would be able to pronounce it and spell it, and thus consider it intelligible and decent. After negotiations over competing claims, Kimberley was annexed to Cape Colony. The mines were quickly consolidated under a company under Cecil Rhodes, a British mining magnate who would become Prime Minister of Cape Colony from 1890 to 1896. Rhodes' company was called De Beers, named after the Dutch settlers upon whose land the diamonds had originally been discovered. Rhodes would play a central role in the events that resulted in the Second Boer War, as well as in the siege of Kimberley. Prior to the outset of war, Kimberley was the center of the De Beers Mining Company, which at the time provided some 90% of the world's diamonds, and still controls approximately a third of the world's rough diamond production today. The website southafrica.net describes Kimberley in 1899 as a rather fancy place, with a new town hall, all sorts of nightly entertainment, and a civilian diamond aristocracy. It was the second largest city in Cape Colony, with a population around 40,000, and being in the far northeast of Cape Colony, was very near the borders of the Boer republics. The De Beers Company had recognized their vulnerability in the case of war, something that became increasingly likely because of the political actions of Rhodes, who was an ardent imperialist who openly supported British annexation of the Boer republics. The town was given a British garrison of 4 companies of the Royal North Lancashire Regiment, as well as various locally raised militia troops under the command of Colonel Robert Kekuich. To Kekuich, and frankly nearly everyone else's dismay, Cecil Rhodes himself decided to relocate to the city as well, a political move clearly intended to bring attention to the defense of the city, and one that was sent to both provoke the Boers and interfere with military authority. However, as Rhodes' companies owned most of the assets of the town, he and De Beers would become central to the town's defense. The outbreak of war would force Kekuich and Rhodes to work together, despite the latter being described as a distinguished statesman who had not a high opinion of the professional capacity of the British officer. City resident T. Phelan wrote of the outbreak of war. The famous ultimatum had gone forth to the world. War had come at last. We in Kimberley were in for it, though happily unconscious of our destiny until it was revealed by the gradations of time. Nothing awful was anticipated. The future was veiled. The knowledge of what was to come was brought home to us by a gradual process that kept us permanently sane. Dull Kimberly was to be enlivened in a manner that made us wish that it were dull again. The siege of Kimberley demonstrated a lack of strategic vision on both sides. The Boers, who lacked an overall strategy, were not so much interested in occupying British territory as they were trying to preserve the ability to govern their own territory. This created something of a conundrum for garrison cities that would be costly to take, forcing the Boers to attempt to besiege the cities rather than taking them by assault, a strategy that cost them the initiative that had allowed their initial gains. The British, on the other hand, had failed to concentrate their own forces, and while they had placed enough of a garrison in Kimberley to defend against an initial attack, authorities had not prepared the city for a prolonged siege. As the Boers cut off the train rails, telegraph lines, and water supply, Kikuich was forced to defend a 22-kilometer, 14-mile defensive perimeter with his limited forces. The central role that Cecil Rhodes and his De Beer employees would play was obvious from the very start. There were large herds of cattle outside of Kimberley, but there weren't nearly enough troops to defend the grazing grounds. They couldn't leave the cattle to the Boers, but if they were to slaughter the cattle, the meat would spoil quickly. George Labram was an American from Detroit, and was employed as the chief engineer of the De Beers mine. A talented engineer, he managed to create from existing materials an industrial refrigeration plant underground in the mine, where the meat could be preserved. But the defenders had a specific disadvantage: artillery. The garrison only had 6 relatively light ordnance RML, or rifle muzzle loading, 2.5-inch mountain guns. These guns were designed for the mountainous battlefields in India and stressed the ability to break them down so that they could be carried by mule. In Kimberley, that meant that these were vulnerable to the larger guns of the Boers. Edward Goff, an engineer from Kimberley, explained in a June 1900 edition of the Proceedings of the Society of Mechanical Engineers. 2.5-inch RML guns, 7-pounders, were not big enough to effectively reply to the enemy's 15-pounders, or to make any impressions on his works. In response, Labram and Goff were asked to do something quite remarkable: build a heavy artillery piece from scratch. The gun started with what Goff described as a billet of hammered mild steel, which had been originally intended for shafting and ordered as such. That is, it was to be the shaft of a large wheel that was intended as part of the mining company, 10.5 inches diameter and 10 feet long. The barrel of the piece would be created by boring steel bar to form the tube, to be strengthened by rings shrunk on. The steel used a lower carbon content than would typically be used by a cannon, but Labram and Goff concluded that it would have sufficient tensile strength. The two then engaged in a search in all books available, and the scattered information so obtained brought together, which collected a small number of references on the making of armaments, and leveraged the experience of employees of the De Beer shop, whose previous experience in Woolwich Arsenal, the Elswick Works, and elsewhere was willingly given to forward the work in hand. In a sign of the political difficulties of the situation, Kikuich opposed the attempt to build a cannon, but Rhodes, owning the shop, ordered that the production proceed. The construction itself represented the challenge of the siege and the Boer strategy of pounding the defenders into submission with their superior artillery. Goff wrote, "During the building of the gun and making of ammunition, the workshops were always under fire from the enemy. Many shells, including 94-pounders, burst around and passed over the buildings. None, however, actually doing any damage. But it was very trying for a man to stay at work at a lathe or other machine, hearing shells bursting around and not knowing whether the next would come inside or not." The engineers had to not only create the parts, including rifling the barrel, but in many cases had to manufacture from scratch the tools needed to do so. The gun was completed in 24 days of continuous work. Like the gun, ammunition had to be custom manufactured. On January 19th, the gun was taken out for testing to help assess its target range. The completed gun was named after Cecil Rhodes and christened Long Cecil. The honor of firing the first round was offered to Lieutenant Colonel G.D. Shamier of the Royal Garrison Artillery. Clearly afraid that the gun might explode, the Lieutenant Colonel demurred, arguing that, as a member of the Royal Regiment, he was permitted to fire only such guns that had been officially approved by the War Office, and that Long Cecil definitely did not fall within this category. Clearly showing his disdain for the British officer, Rhodes told Shamier to stand at a safe distance and called for a Mrs. Pickering, the wife of a secretary to the De Beers Company, who pulled the lanyard and fired the gun. Goff described the result. The enemy appeared much disturbed when the first shells burst in their headquarters. They could be seen hurrying out in all directions, not expecting that they could be reached there. And there was no reply from any gun of theirs during the ranging trial. Long Cecil was operated by a militia unit, the Diamond Fields Artillery, While it required occasional repairs, Long Cecil fired more than 255 shells to ranges in excess of 8,000 yards or 7,300 meters at Boer positions, helping to keep the besiegers at arm's length. An engineer from the Woolwich Arsenal later said of the creation of the gun, "Mechanical engineers work best in peace, but when circumstances called upon them requiring special effort, it was a matter of congratulation that someone was generally there to take hold of whatever there was possible of manipulation and turn out excellent results." But the advantage was not to last. The Boers had a response. In 1897, Kruger had purchased 4 large guns made by the French company Schneider AC from Creusot, France. The guns were the only 4 ever made and intended to be placed in forts to defend Pretoria, the capital of Transvaal. They were massive 155 caliber guns, 4.2 meters or almost 14 feet long, and significantly outranged Long Cecil with a maximum range of some 9,880 meters or almost 11,000 yards. When it became clear that Pretoria was not under immediate threat, the guns, usually called Creusot guns but also called Long Tom, were taken for use against the towns being besieged. But the guns were very heavy. They had to be drawn by oxen, and there were only 4 of them. While Boer commanders around Kimberley had requested one of the guns, they were initially refused, as the guns were already being deployed in other sieges, and 3 of the 4 were in Natal. Ironically, it was the deployment of Long Cecil that compelled Boer leadership to change their mind. One of the massive Creusot guns was sent to support the Boers besieging Kimberley. The gun had been damaged in a British raid in Natal and sent back to Pretoria to be repaired. Because of the damage, the front section of the muzzle had been removed, making it shorter than the others. It arrived February 6th, just 18 days after Long Cecil was first tested, and was brought into action February 7th. In fact, Long Cecil provoked a more powerful artillery assault from the Boers than the town had faced before the gun. In a startling coincidence, a round fired by Long Tom on February 9th hit the Grand Hotel in the middle of town, killing the occupant of the room it hit, George Labram, the man who had been most responsible for building Long Cecil. Originally, the British plan had been to mass troops and march on the capitals of the Boer republics, but demands by Cecil Rhodes and others moved public opinion, obliging the British commanders to relieve the besieged cities. In the same way that Long Cecil had prompted the Boers to deploy the Long Tom, the bombardment of the city by Long Tom compelled the British to send a massive mounted force to end the siege. Major General John French was given command of the mounted force and given the order that, "You must relieve Kimberley if it costs you half your forces." French's force relieved the siege on February 15th, and the besiegers withdrew. French used his cavalry to attempt to capture the Long Tom. The action brought the 2 forces into contact, causing the Boers to dig in. The British were able to bring up their main force, precipitating the Battle of Paardeberg, the first significant British victory of the war. The Long Tom wasn't captured at the time, but the days of the big Creusot guns were already numbered. The guns had been purchased with a limited supply of ammunition, which was slowly being exhausted. One by one, the guns were destroyed by the crews as they ran out of ammunition. The gun used at the Siege of Kimberley was destroyed on April 13th, 1901. None of the Creusot guns remain, although there are a handful of reproductions on display in South Africa. Long Cecil survived the 124-day siege of Kimberley and is still on display in the city. Despite Long Cecil being part of the reason the Boers brought in the Long Tom, the 2 guns never engaged in counter-battery fire with each other. This unique contest between 2 of the largest guns of their era was in some ways representative of the Second Anglo-Boer War, which in many ways was a precursor to the destructive industrialized wars of the coming century. The trench warfare, barbed wire, landmines, machine guns, and destructive artillery barrages that would characterize the Great War were all part of the Second Boer War, the largest and deadliest of the British colonial wars of the Victorian era. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.